Katrine Marçal, journalist på DN, författare och bosatt i Storbritannien, ska leda oss genom diskussionerna idag. Varmt välkommen Katrine, jag lämnar över till dig.
Mycket. Tack. And we will now switch over to English as we are talking about Brexit, and we have international guests. Thank you very much for coming. The United Kingdom's decision to leave the EU was one of several political shocks last year, the other one of course being the election of Donald Trump as President of the United States of America. Take back control was the message of the Leave campaign in the UK. America first is the message of President Trump, and many analysts believed last year that 2017 would herald in a new era of protectionism when it comes to trade that would dismantle the kind of globalization that we have known for several decades. Is this analysis true, or is this narrative exaggerated? Many believe that trade relations would move from a rule-based system and towards a system driven more by populism and nationalism, and the world would be a zero-sum game again. In September last year, the World Trade Organization did slash its forecast for growth in trade to just 1.7%, which would mean that trade would grow slower than GDP for the first time in 15 years. TTIP, the proposed transatlantic trade deal between the EU and the United States, was pronounced dead several times last year. And of course, at the end of March this year, the United Kingdom triggered Article 50, which began the country's divorce process from the EU. For us in Sweden, we are a small export-based economy trying to make sense of all of this and trying to sort of find our position in a new EU without our British friends. And thank you very much to Vinge for organizing this event, because in these volatile times, it's more important than ever maybe for businesses to try to understand what is going on in these big forces that shape the world. And we are going to try to help you with this today, or maybe just make you confused on a higher level, but that can be useful as well. So, how do we handle the trade effects of Brexit and a reshaped EU? We have an eminent panel here today. I'm going to start by introducing our first two guests. Mr. Alistair Sutton from Brickcourt Chambers, who has been immersed in European Union law for nearly 40 years. Among other things, he was the legal advisor to the Commission Vice President responsible for the launch of the Single Market Project between 1985 and 1990. Welcome, Alistair Sutton. And we have Maria Åsenius, Head of Cabinet for Sweden's EU-kommissioner, Cecilia Malmström, who needs no introduction here, and who, of course, is the Trade Commissioner. Please come up on stage. Water.
Yeah, oh,
yes.
There's one for you.
Thank you, thank you. Maria might need some water as well. So, Brexit, we hear a lot about it, and Theresa May, the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, she still is, said that Brexit means Brexit. But then there's been many other sort of definitions launched. We've heard here about a hard Brexit, a soft Brexit, red, white and blue Brexit, a Brexit for the many, not the few. What does Brexit mean?
You know, first of all, thank you very much for having me here, and it's a great honor and a pleasure to come back to Sweden. And the last time I was here, it was 3 months ago, and I was saying to colleagues just now that things have changed quite a bit in the last 3 months. Quite a bit, in a sense, for the worse. It's more uncertain now, given the election result, than it was 3 months ago. In Brussels, you know, we have a tradition these days when we go out for dinner or drinks or we meet friends, we talk about Brexit-free zones. Because I, for one, I've run out of expletives and I've run out of hyperboles to describe my disappointment, to put it at its lowest, about Brexit. And the use of slogans has become absolutely appalling and has done nothing whatsoever to remove the two key words which I think resonate throughout this whole process, which is legal uncertainty. Legal uncertainty for states, for the EU institutions, for business, for individuals, for EU citizens, for UK citizens. Uncertainty reigns and has done ever since the referendum was called, and certainly since the result, and certainly since the Article 50 letter, and it runs on. And, well, we hope that perhaps on the 30th of March 2019 we may be in a world of certainty, but I'm afraid we will not. And I think I'll start with that point. Let's get rid of slogans. From the very outset, I remember Brick Court Chambers holding a seminar, and an eminent former Chancellor of the Exchequer, Lord Lawson, was there. And he said, it'll be all right, I mean, Britain, free trade areas, no trouble at all. We'll have those in place in 5 minutes.
He's a prominent Brexiteer.
He was a prominent Brexiteer, and after 2 red wines, or perhaps even only 1, I had the courage to say to him, frankly, this is misleading. You have a duty to inform people of what you are offering as an alternative. By all means, leave the EU, but what is the sunlit uplands into which you are leading us? He couldn't say. And I think here today, I have to say, I, for one, am very close to the process, both in Brussels and in London. I haven't the slightest idea what the United Kingdom is looking for. Okay. On the other hand, the European Union, as always, and Maria will know this better than I do, we have in the EU procedures which have been followed, we have guidelines, we have a mandate, we have 8 position papers of the Commission. We know exactly where the EU is going step by step. We have not the slightest idea. This is gross irresponsibility by the British government, vis-à-vis notably British industry, but also our friends in Sweden and others, for example.
Maria, do you agree from the Commission's perspective that you have no idea where the British are going?
Yes.
You agree?
I mean, it's pretty. It's
okay.
pretty. No, but it's
pretty
pretty
clear. Very short seminar.
No, it's not like I have a special crystal ball. But it's very clear that those who voted for Brexit 1 year ago didn't know what kind of Brexit they voted for. Some really wanted a more inward-looking UK. Others wanted to somehow resurrect the glorious days when the UK was a world power and the sun never went down. But it was not at all clear what kind of Brexit. Then Theresa May decided to interpret the outcome as a hard Brexit, which means not stay in the single market, not stay in a customs union, because, of course, that's also possible models. But instead, a hard Brexit meaning that the UK leaves these things and, as a third country, independent third country, negotiate a trade agreement with the EU. So that was her version. But after the latest elections, nobody knows, because obviously that was not a popular choice among the British public. So here we are. I think the UK at some point was very upset with the EU because we were very tough when starting these negotiations, saying that there has to be a clear sequence here. We start by talking about 2 important issues, namely the rights of EU citizens in the UK and vice versa, UK citizens in European countries. And we talk about debts and
financial settlement.
Yeah, the financial settlement, who owes whom what. And when that is done, we start talking about the contours of our future relationship. Theresa May used to be very upset about this and say we have to talk about everything at the same time and start with trade at the same time as everything else. Right now, I think they may be grateful in London that we have this sequencing because they don't know what relation they want with us.
I think Maria's mentioned a very important 2 more words, which are, you often find 2-word phrases which say a lot, And I was saying to Maria just now, my first job in the Commission was a trade negotiator. And we had 9 member states, now we have 28, well, soon to be 27. But we always used to talk about third countries. And I think, of course, the United Kingdom has been 44 years. We've forgotten what it's like to be a third country. And I remember, as a Commission negotiator, keeping Canada or the United States or Japan or the GATT members waiting for days, sometimes weeks, while we made up our mind. And to be a third country and to have to knock on the door, as Sweden once did. By the way, the reason you are in the EU is because you didn't want to be always outside in that room over there waiting for the EU to make up its mind and then going, oh, please, could you possibly tell? You wanted to be at the table, and you were. The United Kingdom, I think, at the level of politicians and civil servants, has yet to realize what it's like to be a third country, whatever is the shape of our new trade arrangement with the EU.
But if we try to understand the British for a while, which is, obviously useful in a negotiation. So the reason why Theresa May went for this hard Brexit, that no Norwegian solution, Britain leaving the customs union and the single market as well, that was because she wanted, as they call it in the British debate, control of the borders, right? Is that still happening? Is hard Brexit still Or is there hope? I mean, in the Labour Party, there's a discussion now that maybe they should go for a softer Brexit, staying members of the single market. I mean, from a Swedish perspective, of course, I think most people in Sweden would want Britain to stay in the single market. Is that still on the table after the election?
An opinion poll yesterday in the United Kingdom found that 54% of people asked whether trade or immigration was more important, found that trade was more important because they begin to see the economic effects already, whereas immigration, people begin to realize that in the hospitality industry, in agriculture and so on, we absolutely need people coming into our country to fill in these jobs. And by the way, they contribute massively to the economy through the taxes they pay. There are less than 1% of benefit takers amongst our immigrants, which is not the case in Sweden, by the way. So the tide is changing slightly. I have the greatest doubt whether the Prime Minister or most of the other cabinet ministers who deal with this have the slightest idea what they're talking about.
Okay.
Despite the excellent briefings from the civil servants. I've also worked for a politician who actually read his briefs, but most politicians do not read things they're given. I say that because you were kind enough to mention Lord Cofield's name. What we did in 1985 was the most remarkable thing in post-war European history, he said modestly. And that was to remove internal frontiers completely. Why did we do that? It happened on the 1st of January 1993. Why did we do it? To remove costs for industry. What is this Prime Minister doing? Voluntarily reimposing costs for British industry going through an austerity period. I have never heard of such an irresponsible, ill-informed decision in all my life, let alone raising barriers to trade with our near trading neighbours such as Sweden. It's absolutely incomprehensible.
But she does this because she believes that free movement to the United Kingdom needs to end. I'm just trying to...
Of course.
Take her perspective.
Yes.
Somebody has to.
But I think that she is very formed by the fact that she was Home Affairs Minister for many years.
That's right.
Yes.
That's
and
right.
therefore more obsessed with borders than maybe she would have otherwise been. But at least now the single market option, I think, is more on the table now than before the elections, since she didn't get support for the hard Brexit line that she had before the elections.
Yeah. I think one thing needs to be clear about this single market concept, though, with due deference to Maria. There is no such thing as membership of the single market. This is an illusion in the United Kingdom. The single market is an integral part of the treaties. You cannot be a member of the... You can have access to the single market, but the only people who can be members of it are members of the European Union, because the single market is intrinsically related to all the other policies, especially since the Maastricht Treaty and now the Lisbon Treaty. And legally, you cannot separate it.
And in addition, there are 4 freedoms here, and you can't just pick 3 of them and forget the 4th one, namely freedom for labour to move.
I'd like to say something that perhaps Maria is not able to say today, which is that I do believe that Cameron handled the negotiations on free movement of persons badly. I want to say that if I listen to colleagues in Sweden talk about immigration in Sweden, it is absolute, and by the way, I hear it from Belgian politicians. Didier Reynders said this just the other day. The Treaty of Rome talked, first of all, about the free movement of workers and not people. We never anticipated mass movements of people such as we're seeing within the EU, let alone refugees from Syria and Iraq and Libya. There is a need to devise social policies which not only assure the free movement of people, but the integration of people, the assimilation of people, culturally, linguistically, traditionally, so on, into our societies. Because otherwise, that is not the failure to do that, which is an EU responsibility as well as a national one, is a recipe for disaster, I think. So actually, there would have been scope for negotiating a solution which gave due attention to the need to devise policies to assure a better integration. But unfortunately, that didn't happen, and as we know, the rest is history, sadly. Of course, an important question is, can we now go back or turn the clock back? And I think Macron had a very good answer to that. It wasn't a legal answer, but it was a good political answer. He said the door is open until the door is closed. But that, you know, typical enarch, you see, brilliant intellectual. He knew without even being a lawyer that that's the right legal answer. Because until midnight on the 29th of March 2019, the UK is a full member of the European Union. At least that's the legal position.
And we also have President Tusk's quote from 10 days ago at the European Council on whether the UK could change its mind. And I think he said, I'm a dreamer and I'm not the only one.
Yes,
That's
very
right.
nice.
He's old enough to remember the Beatles. That's great.
But I mean, certainly, so I mean, people are saying after this election, which didn't work out as Theresa May had planned it, that the option of no deal, that there isn't a deal between the EU and the United Kingdom on future relations before the deadline passes, the risk of that has increased. So business is, of course, afraid of this, but this is not in the interest of the rest of the EU either, to have no deal, is it, Maria?
No, I think the best thing for everybody is to have a negotiated solution. And once we have that, I think we will also have to negotiate a transition period because everything cannot be put in place in 1 year.
Two more words, you see, transition period. Time is running. I mean, the UK has wasted so much time. It's absolutely extraordinary. It's now, is it a year? Was it 23rd?
Yes,
It's almost a year.
yes.
Is it today or
Midsummer,
yesterday?
we know, we will, Swedes will not forget. They
You'll remember it.
woke up with a terrible hangover after Midsummer Eve.
Oh. And, you know, of course, a very interesting question is whether 27 states will agree on before the 29th of March 2019 to run it on for another year or two. I don't know. Personally, I have a great doubt about that for the simple reason that it's all change in the EU in 2019, or starting at the end of 2018. Elections to the European Parliament, new Commission. And I think two things. I think first, the EU institutions now want to get this done. In order to move on, we have to accept that Brexit is Brexit, and there's no going back by the UK.
Is there no going back?
By the UK.
By the UK.
By the UK. Of course, you know, as Harold Macmillan once said, events, dear boy, events. I mean, we have no idea what political events may happen. Mr. Corbyn may take it differently. Sorry, I shouldn't say that, should I? Anyway, but anything could happen in the UK. The second thing, though, I think, is that the EU, of course, with the election results in Holland and France and so on, there is a determination, which I can fully understand, to realize the European project. And I think the Merkel-Macron double locomotive, plus Spain, often forgotten, plus the Benelux, is it's a fantastic thing. And I think what we're going to see is the UK boat leaving the harbour, or the harbour leaving the boat. I'm not sure which is going in which direction. I worry that people talk about the need for a transitional period as if it's done like that. It is not. The EU will need a mandate, not only for Part 2 and Part 3 of the negotiations, but also for a TP. And the UK will need to see what kind of transitional period we want. If I had a crystal ball, Maria doesn't have a very clear one, nor do I, but I would say the EEA, adapted, tailored, is the most obvious way to go. But even the EEA, as Sweden knows very well, even the EEA is not an automatic option. No. There are negotiations. And above all, it's the legal changes. The EU is a union of law and lawyers and legal procedures. And you can't just make it up on the back of an envelope, even if Mrs. May thinks you can.
No, it has to be negotiated as well, especially since it could be there for years. You never know.
Exactly.
So what would happen with the jurisdiction of the European Court, for example? I mean, key issues,
Yeah, European Court of Justice. So Theresa May has said that's a red line for Britain.
Yeah, but during that transition period, for example, we have to have a clear idea there too.
Yeah.
I think it's understandable, by the way, that the European Court should retain jurisdiction, and I'll tell you why. In the United Kingdom, we have something called the Great Repeal Bill. Well, it's not so great anymore. It's just the Repeal Bill now, I think. Anyway, but the idea, in very simple terms, is because in Whitehall, people say, what the hell do we do about using, our newfound freedom as a sovereign state to... and then someone said, well, Prime Minister, actually it's very difficult because we've got 44 years of stuff. It's about this high off the floor. All we can do is freeze it. So the repeal bill aims on the 1st of April 2019. We will have in the EU exactly the same rules as we had the day before when we were a full member.
The world's biggest copy-paste
exactly.
exercise.
And then successive governments can pick and choose and change and not change and so on. But especially as far as EU citizens in the UK are concerned, they have acquired rights. They are entitled to the protection of those rights, not only from the British courts, but we can't trust the British government to maintain full EU citizens' rights afterwards because successive governments may change them. Therefore, I can perfectly understand that the EU would say, I'm sorry, on the acquis communautaire, so far as it stays in force in the UK, there would be the possibility of references to the ECJ. And I think to let go on that is a red line for the EU, let alone for the UK.
So I'm going to welcome up the rest of the panel to bring in more of the Swedish perspective. Erik Lagerlöf, who's Senior Associate at Vinge and Adjunct Professor of Law at Stockholm School of Economics. We have Lena Sellgren, Chief Economist, Business Sweden, and Alexandra Stråberg, Head of Research and Analysis for Skanska Financial Services. So, I mean, basically the conclusion for the first part of the panel is that the British government has no idea what it's doing. So that's kind of worrying from a business perspective, isn't it, Lena?
Yes, it is. And we already see some increased activities among the Swedish companies, actually, especially the ones who are trading with the UK, not having own production within the UK, asking for what could be the possible outcome of this, and especially when it comes to labor, the migration perspective. So we have a lot of questions coming in from the companies, and
what do you tell them?
We tell them that we actually don't know right now, because it's a long period that we will see ahead with big uncertainty. And uncertainty means, of course, lower investments, consumption, and some companies wait and see. Others do think about, should we go into the UK? If you're just exporting, maybe you should think about going into the UK, but then they ask for, will there be labor supply and that one? So it's quite tricky. But what we say is actually that all companies and ourselves should follow this very closely, and also try to make up scenarios and look into what parts will actually affect my own company and the business where I am in.
Yeah, there were new figures this week about
to follow, and
investment in the British car industry going down 75% in a year's time. So, Erik Lagerlöf, I know that you think that Swedish companies are kind of underestimating the risks of Brexit.
Yes, I do, actually. The first thing, and I think we touched upon it already, is time. And I'd like to say this first, by the way, is that we are dealing with two separate agreements in all likelihood. The first is a divorce agreement, how the UK actually leaves the European Union. That is the agreement that is meant to come into force late March 2019. And on top of that, we have a future trade agreement, or an agreement that is meant to regulate or govern future relations. And March 2019, the divorce, it's not far away. And I know that the EU has put out a schedule and said that actually we need to be done negotiating by October 2018, just over a year from now, in order to get it through by March 2019. That's, well, say a year from now, that's very, very soon. I mean, I get, in my inbox, I get 5 emails a day saying that we are getting a new data regulation that will change the lives of all companies in Sweden, because it deals with how companies manage its data. But that's just a tiny, tiny point of what the relationship with the UK is all about, and the rules that will change, and the new game plan that will come into force. So that's a very important point to make, and that one needs to underline that. It's time. It's coming soon.
So, Alexandra Stråberg, obviously, so Skanska is a company in the UK. What's your thinking regarding Brexit?
Well, it's sort of like you have to prepare for what you don't know, and you have to prepare really well for something you don't know. So good luck with that.
Yes.
Yeah. But I think that what we did was, I mean, we have an administration at Skanska here in Sweden, my department that looks into the risks and the opportunities with macroeconomic situation and politics, of course, and then we have the one in UK. And when this happened, when the Brexit was a true fact, then of course we have to look at the immediate effects, which are the first, I mean, our currency effects. The second one that we have done is that what you need to do is then you need to scrutinize yourselves. So we had to look within the company and see, okay, what do we have right now? What parts could we possibly change, maybe to, to change the business mix, I guess. And the third part is looking ahead of time. So what are we most scared of what will happen? And of course, scrutinizing and looking at the market continuously, because the dialogue is just, I mean, it's an ongoing dialogue.
There was a government minister in Britain, Andrea Leadsom, who recently criticised the media for not being patriotic enough when we're reporting on Brexit. So on that note, I'm going to ask, are there any opportunities with Brexit for businesses?
Can I just say one thing first? We've all been very negative about Brexit. I think it presents enormous challenges. However, I do think it is. I don't know if it's a fact actually. The UK does have a legal right to change its mind, as Alistair mentioned. Well, I believe so. But I also think that fine, Brexit happened, and or it's about to happen. We must look forward, and I think the best way forward is to be constructive. And we must try to find the opportunities. I think that is absolutely essential. And I think Sweden, as a country, and also for Swedish business, it is essential to have a very, very good relationship with the UK. The United Kingdom is by far our closest ally within the EU. I used to work at the European Court of Justice. I used to work for first the Swedish judge and then the British judge. I know that the value that the Brits have put into the European Union, it will be an enormous loss. And I think it's essential to try to have as a close a relationship as possible with the United Kingdom going forward. Because one thing is rules will change, but also the dynamics within the European Union will change. And we need to be close to the United Kingdom.
Can I just say two things about that? First, I don't want to. We're certainly not going to put Maria on the spot on the legal issue. Whether it can be reversed or not is, of course, partly a legal issue. Interpretation of Article 50 is not very clear. Jean-Claude Piris from the Council Legal Service said it was reversible and so on. I prefer to take this position, which is that, as a public international lawyer, until our membership, until our accession to the EU treaties ends, we are parties. And until that moment comes, if the process stops, it stops. What I do say, and I think many in the EU would sort of be in a way glad, the Germans and the French and so on, certainly Sweden, I guess. But that's not the issue. I think we have, in a way, passed a point of no return. As soon as the negotiations begin, we have already, in a certain way, become a third country. Article 50, paragraph 3 refers to the fact that the UK may not sit in any of the meetings which are negotiating meetings, but of course the negotiations cover every single thing. And so I think we have almost got to the point where if we do stay, it will be in a materially different and less advantageous way, rebuilding confidence, which we've lost over 40 years anyway through 6 intergovernmental conferences negotiating opt-outs and derogations and God knows what. So I think we almost have passed it, but as I say, in politics we don't know. Talking about opportunities, well, in foreign policy terms, there is an opportunity. I think what we're going to see, my crystal ball here is a little bit hazy too, but over the next 20 or 30 years is a tightening of the core of the European project. And there is scope, and this is where the leadership of the United Kingdom could be fantastically helpful, with Turkey, with Switzerland, with Norway, with Russia, with Ukraine, with Belarus, with the North African countries, but certainly I'm talking about a pan-European basis, of building something better than the EEA, which was sort of a parking lot, if I may say that. We don't need something like the EEA. What we need is a strategic ring around the core members. States that don't want to be part of the single currency, I had an awful thought last night. I was wondering about Sweden.
Yes, this is what I'm thinking about as well.
But I leave my Swedish friends to raise that
Yes.
issue. But there is a military security. I mean, I was listening to things this morning about this island that we're standing on with our friends to the east. And so on. So there's a lot to think about. And the EU's two greatest foreign policy failings in the 44 years I've been in Brussels are, number one, Turkey. You cannot blow hot and cold with a state as important as Turkey. Massive failure by the EU, and massive failure with Russia. The failure to engage when the single market really took shape, instead of crowing about it and disparaging Comic-Con, CMEA, which was rubbish anyway, as we know, was to say to them, let's build a pan-European free trade area which can build into a genuine pan-continental cooperation with Russia. Russia before Putin, by the way. Russia with Gorbachev, Kohl, Mitterrand, Cofield, Delors. We had a chance, we missed it. And now we have to try to go back to that. And the UK leadership would be crucial with countries like Norway, Switzerland, Turkey, and so on. I believe that's an opportunity.
But to stick on this, stay on this idea of sort of Brexit means that the EU core will sort of move closer to ever closer union. You know, what will happen to Sweden, for example? I mean, I know that the white paper that the Commission published, different scenarios for the future of the EU. In at least one of them, every country in the remaining EU were joining the euro. This is certainly something that I think Sweden is probably not prepared to do. Is this something that we should worry about, Maria?
No. No,
Okay.
because I think there is also an understanding that one does what is politically possible, and Sweden has had 2 referendums already. So,
Yeah.
but generally speaking, I know that the support for EU membership has risen after Brexit. I think many citizens realize that one cannot maybe take everything. One cannot take the EU for granted, and actually, it does a lot of good things.
Has the EU learned something from Brexit? Will there be a different approach?
No, I think that the feeling is that the EU is a cooperation between democracies who voluntarily want to cooperate, and if one country does not want to do it anymore, it has a right to leave. So let's have an organized exit, preferably, and that's it. I regret it myself. I really
So
would
not anything on free movement, for example, one size
No,
fits all
I think
approach?
that is very, very clear, that one cannot cherry pick. So even if I can agree that we should have as close relations as possible afterwards, at the same time, you cannot have a cake and eat it too, even if Boris Johnson insists.
Exactly.
So there are certain things you get with membership, and
Erik Lagerlöf wanted to come in, and then Lena Sellgren.
Just a very small point on the Eurozone. We are not a member of the Eurozone. And of course, well, we are formally required to join, actually, but and I'm sure there would be no demand from the European Union that we do join. But it might be difficult to stay out or ignore it. I mean, there are already signs from the European Union that the things are changing. There are concrete proposals, say, for example, on the location of clearinghouses and dealing with euros. And this is a long-standing debate or battle between the Bank of England and the ECB, I suppose. Yes. But we will have to face the same issues. We have been hiding behind the United Kingdom. The United Kingdom has been our support within the European Union. The UK is no longer there. We will have to face up to some of these issues. So certainly, I think the Eurozone and our membership or not taking part of it will be a factor to consider in the future.
Lena Sellgren, you wanted to come in?
Yes, and actually how I see the Brexit is more like a sign of the time that we are living in right now, and also wakening up for the EU that something has to be done.
Yeah.
I cannot answer that question, what exactly should be done, but I think that hopefully we can move into something in the future at least that is even better. What we have, even though I see that the UK leaving the EU is negative when we take it in a global perspective, and we have the US or North America, Asia, and a weaker Europe to that extent, since UK is the 5th largest market.
Alexandra wanted to come in.
Yeah. No, I just think, I mean, we're talking about negotiations and how long everything takes, and one thing that sort of grasps the effects immediately is the market. So it's for a company like us who are sort of directly affected by stuff that happens to the market, we can already see the changes. And I'm not sure if it's good or bad. We can see differences in, let's say, we do both buildings for the public sector and for the private sector. So the private sector, there are different kinds of investors. And so we have seen a change in the type of investors that now come into the UK. So the traditional ones that are looking for low risk, they are sort of going into other markets. And we can see an inflow of other investment companies that are looking for much, much higher risks, of course. And if we see it as something good for the UK and what's going to be out of this, I don't know. But what we can say is some of the financial companies are looking to, dislocate parts of their companies to other countries, looking, for instance, at Central Europe. So we have also business in Central Europe, so for us it's like a neutral game. But the market reacts very quickly and adapts also very quickly, and so has all the companies have to do the same way.
And of course, the way the market reacts also shapes the process going forward.
Exactly.
Yeah. So Lena Sellgren was talking about this needs to be a wake-up call for the EU. You don't seem to agree, Maria Åsenius.
Yes, but I think that it actually has led to more people supporting the EU than before the Brexit referendum. But you said something in the beginning, Katrine. You observed that both in the Brexit referendum and in the US election campaign, there was a theme about we have to take back control, no to international rules, more populism, and trade is a zero-sum game. I agree, but since then there have also been a counter movement.
Interesting,
there.
I was going to ask you about that. Go on.
And I am also very happy to see that, and I think this has more to do with the election of President Trump than Brexit, that EU member states have been fantastically united in saying that trade is actually basically a very good thing, and we want more of it. I have never seen trade ministers being so united. And also we had conclusions from the European Council some 10 days ago that was also very clear on, trade is good and protectionism doesn't protect. And trade is not a zero-sum game, even if Trump thinks so.
I agree with Maria. I think there's one important value that has not very often been mentioned in the United Kingdom or in the United States. When Mrs. May said in her letter, and she repeated it, as she always does, 28 times in the letter.
They call it a Maybot.
It wasn't strong and stable or whatever it was, but anyway. But she said, we share the values of the EU, so don't worry about that. Actually, the most important value for me in the EU since the Second World War is solidarity. In a way, what we've done in leaving, I said once on television, in the summing up, the commentator asked me to find a word, and I couldn't, on the spur of the moment, find it. And then I said, I think it's a very selfish action by my country. And by that I mean we are, putting UK first again, or putting America first again. There's a certain similarity. But that solidarity between nations has grown, as Maria said, I think, following Brexit and following Trump's election. When Merkel said, very interestingly and in a very mature and wise way to Mr. Trump, of course we'll work with you, provided we can work on the basis of shared values. As always with Mrs. Merkel, you have to look very carefully and look behind the words. But that was very clear. Didn't run over there and hold hands walking through the rose garden, Can I just say one other thing to Maria, though, about trade? It is a good thing, yes, absolutely a good thing. But I have seen in the last few years in the TTIP negotiations that there is a disconnect in our globalized village that we live in between the elites. And I was a member of an elite, probably still am a member of the elite. We're all members of the elite, in the Commission and the Council and the Parliament. I was a member of an elite negotiating trade agreements with Japan and in the Tokyo Round and all the rest of it. We listened to industries who wanted protection. We didn't listen much to consumer groups. And one of the reasons for that is consumers are very badly organized. And they're weak lobby bodies because they're segmented, Whereas the steel industry, the textile industry, the shipbuilding industry, you know who they are, type of thing. And I went to a reception for TTIP in one of the German state representations, and all of a sudden, about 500 people there, all of a sudden, about 100 people lifted up these banners, and they started singing this song from, what is it? Yeah, and it was, and
it's from Les Misérables.
Les Misérables. I said, what should we do? Oh my God, get the police in and get them out. So anyway, luckily, I don't know, they sang 10 verses of this song, and then they put the banners down, and they all left.
Germany has very well-organized protesters.
Well, this was Greenpeace, I guess.
These guys travelled all around.
Oh, right.
Yeah.
But no, anyway, serious point is we have to find a way as government, whether it's in TTIP or whether it's in the single market, whether it's in Sweden maybe, or in the UK, to reach people, to reach workers, people who've lost their jobs, people who don't have jobs, young people who find it difficult to get jobs in Spain or Portugal. We've got to find a new way. I've always thought that democracy cuts both ways. It's your obligation as a citizen to inform yourself, but we have to find new ways. And I think if I had to make one change in the EU, I would re-empower national parliaments and regional, local parliaments, and somehow, with the European Parliament level. But I'm not good at this, but something has to be done.
Do you agree?
Yes and no. Yes, and I think we have changed our way of working since the days when you had the pleasure of negotiating trade.
Yeah, sure.
We cannot just sit and negotiate in a black box and then come up 3 years later and say, ta-da, please vote yes. We have to explain from the beginning what we are doing and why constantly. TTIP was always the most controversial negotiation, so in a way we are also helped by the fact that it's now in the freezer, and we'll see what happens. But we definitely have to explain what we are doing, and I think that inequality that you also mentioned in the beginning, Catherine, is an issue. The problem is that we wouldn't be helped by suppressing trade, because trade does make us richer. Yes. It's true that trade doesn't automatically spread the richness or the riches or the benefits equally. But there we have, and that's very much in the hands of nation states to, of course, make sure that there is an income distribution if that is what society wants. I mean, Sweden is an example of a country that is very open to trade and still a relatively equal country compared with practically all other countries.
Yeah.
Erik?
No, just one final point. I believe time is running short, but what I would like to emphasize is that we take great pride in being good Europeans here in Sweden. To some extent that is true, of course, but in my experience, and I say this very much as a lawyer, we are not very good at dealing with EU law. And EU law is far more important than most people understand or perceive, and that goes for business as well. And I think, in terms of Brexit, we haven't quite understood how much or to what extent Brexit will affect Sweden. And I encourage business to do that analysis before March 2019, to what extent actually EU law affects their business and their perspectives.
So we have until 2:45, so we're going to open up to the audience soon.
Okay.
But we have, there's a free trade deal coming with Japan, is the rumor this week.
Yes, I heard from my commissioner who just got back from Japan yesterday, that we are really making good progress. And of course the goal is to really sort out the last outstanding issues before EU leaders meet in Hamburg in a few days for the G20 meetings. I hope that will be a moment of success.
So from a business perspective, Lena and Alexandra, this sort of backlash against trade, which exists or doesn't exist, but at least is debated, is that something that, how are businesses perceiving that and looking at that risk?
Oh, I can start. I should say that even though we have this situation, and the uncertainty means that we will see the reallocation of investments within the European Union for sure, but I think we will still continue to trade with one of our most important trading partners, the UK, of course. And it's trade and business is not just about the tariffs and barriers. So I believe that we will still continue, but to a higher cost. And add to that is actually that it differs a lot between large companies and small, medium-sized, because it will relatively hit more to the small and medium-sized companies.
Alexandra, do you want to add something to that?
Yeah, I mean, even though Skanska is not a trading company in that term, we like trade because trading countries are not fighting countries, so that's good. But I think that, I mean, our biggest challenge is about the free movement. If we look ahead of time, like for instance in London right now, there are about 350,000 construction workers. Out of those, about 100,000 are EU nationals. So if you take that into consideration with everything that the UK wants to do in infrastructure and building 1 million houses and all of that, it's not going to be possible to do that. So that's then also is sort of a tight thing, and then to achieve the GDP development that you want to achieve. And for us as a construction company, the EU nationals are vital. They are immense for our development. So that's, I would say, is our biggest fear going forward.
So before we let the audience in, if we try to be as hands-on as possible, what should sort of Swedish businesses do to sort of hedge against the Brexit risks? Erik?
Well, they should do three things, I think. Well, first, and this they are aware of, that they should analyze their exposure to the UK, and of course, that's something companies do frequently, and they know this, of course. But second, and again, I come back to this point, they have to analyze their exposure to EU law, and to what extent the rules will actually change, because that will tell you something about what will happen post-Brexit and how to deal with it. And I don't want to sound all doom and gloom, because I don't think that's the right approach. But you need to analyze and you need to realize what risks or opportunities, for that matter, there are in order to be able to deal with them. So that's the second point. The third point now is for Swedish business, I think. I mean, you see a lot of it in the UK. They try to talk to the government, to say, business in the UK, they try to tell the British government, we need this or we need that in a future agreement with the European Union. To some extent, for those companies that are most affected here in Sweden, for example, we ought to do the same. We ought to tell our government, or indeed the Commission, that we will like to see this and that in a future trade agreement with the United Kingdom. So those three, I think, aspects are important for a company to consider today.
Lena, what are you telling your members?
Yeah, I fully agree. And maybe you can add to that the small, medium-sized companies do have to look into their global footprint. And also see if there are other possibilities, and also make clear or be clear about how can it in different scenarios affect my own company, what's important for the business where I am into, because it will differ between the service sector and goods, for example, which is quite more regulated than for services, and the non-tariff barriers are very important as well to understand, as Erik said. I fully agree that you have to understand as much as possible and use the experts out there.
Alexandra, you mentioned migration already. Any other?
Yeah, no, I think that, I mean, I honestly don't think the companies are that naive. I mean, if I look at Skanska, for instance, we did our research before Brexit. My department will still have job to do continuously until I don't know when. But I think that that goes with the territory to do the risk analysis truly well, and also, I mean, prepare for the unexpected. That's what we do. Try to be flexible, continuous analysis, and that's what most companies, I would say, do. Otherwise, they don't survive. Because, I mean, that's the way it is in any market, I would say, in general.
Can I go back to two words, legal uncertainty, because this is what we're talking about. And the trouble is, of course, it's all very well to ask the UK government to provide greater legal certainty for industries after the 19th of March 2019. But actually, as long as they don't have, A, a clear position of what we actually want, B, an indication of whether the EU would accept it, C, what the legal formulation of that would be, it's very, very difficult. You know, you in the City of London, you hear all the time demands from banks and insurance companies and hedge funds and so on to know what will be the future rules of access and all that. And of course, it is actually impossible. One small area that Maria is going to be involved in is the disentanglement of the UK from our agreements with third countries. This is part of the first mandate, which is currently on the table. And on the timing point, let me just make one thing very clear. We've had one round of negotiations on the Monday, the 19th of whenever it was, May, when David Davis came over and accepted
June,
came over and accepted immediately that there would have to be not parallelism but a sequential approach to negotiations. But there are 9 areas covered by the first part of the mandate. And at some point, and we haven't even got on to citizens' rights, not really. We haven't got on to financial settlement. We haven't got on to disentanglement. We haven't got on to Ireland. So my point is these 4-week cycles of negotiations, taking account of the August holiday, the Christmas holiday, the Easter, as Erik said, we're very soon going to be at the end of 2018. So my point here is we need, on the EU side, because the EU have to educate and lead the British, unfortunately, on this. And on the British side, we have to accept very early on that indeed, if we are to avoid the famous cliff edge, another term I hate.
So cliff edge is the UK crashing out of the EU
with no agreement.
Which is what business
and falling
fears
into
most.
the WTO, which is not the end of the world, but
and
still.
Can you even fall into the WTO?
We will need some form of transitional arrangement. And as Maria said, there has to be a mandate for this, it has to be negotiated. And in a very simplistic way, what I would say is, you can't do 2 things at once. So once we've got the divorce sorted, and probably before the end of that, the European Council is going to have to say to the Commission, right, okay, we will never do a complete, finalized deal. Therefore, there has to be some form of transition. What is it going to be? What do you want, UK? What are we prepared to give? And that in itself will be a very difficult negotiation for the first half of 2018, in my view. That's an optimistic view. So, like the cliff edge or not like the cliff edge, we're going to be at the end of 2018 with European Parliament elections, new Commission people being suggested, we know the scene, It's going to be very hard to avoid the cliff edge, which brings us to whether the WTO is a good option for Sweden and the UK and the EU. Not perfect, but at least it's better than nothing, probably.
Not really good for anybody.
We can't rule it out.
And the thing that the UK has that the EU wants is money, right? That's the big sort of bargaining chip, paying for continued access to certain parts of the single market, isn't it?
Well, there has to... The thing is, if the Germans have to pay more to Poland, the German Bundestag will not like it. If the Poles get less from, they won't like it. So in the end of the day, the number which will be negotiated will be an objective number calculated by accountants in the European Commission.
Check what Norway is paying. It's quite a lot.
It's a lot, yes. It's a lot. It's more per capita than Britain is currently paying, isn't it? So I'm going to... Opening up to the audience, I will take 2 or 3 questions at once and try to keep your questions short and sweet and actual questions, please. Thank you. So, gentlemen in the back.
They don't have to be sweet.
Hi.
Okay, they don't have to be sweet. They just have to be short and actual questions.
So I'm living in Denmark and working in Sweden. So first point is that open borders are an aspiration as far as Sweden is concerned. I get my passport checked every day, but okay. More to the point, Swedish business employs a significant number of British citizens whose status is also part of this. And I assume Swedish business would like those people to stay here. Yes?
Yes. Okay, so the question is, what would we do? Okay. So we have Carl Tannen in front.
Oh, sorry.
Yes, it seems to me, as I understand your reasoning, is that there is no legal reason for the agreement once it's made. It should pass Parliament, and you seem to take it for granted that will not become any problem.
The UK Parliament.
The UK Parliament. In spite of, when something comes to a Parliament, there is always a lot of forces starting to move to the left or to the right or whatever. So, and that is the legal analysis. And then there is a political analysis. There is always another parliamentary election. Why do you assume that the outcome of this negotiation process will be a stable one? There will be a new election every 5 years, perhaps every 3 years. Yeah. So you will never have a stable solution that you can rely on being as stable as a membership, or am I wrong?
Okay, so a question about the domestic politics in Britain, how's that going to affect the future? And there's one last one, the gentleman there in the middle behind you.
Hi, Aidan Little, number 2 at the British Embassy in Stockholm. I don't want to make this a big debate, so I'm not going to. I'm not going to take up too much time, and I don't disagree with much of what's been said. I don't want to downplay how complicated this is going to be and how much effort it's going to take to get a good agreement. But I do just want to challenge the caricature that the British government has no idea what it wants. That's not true.
Thank you.
Now, of course, there's a lot of detail which has to be left to the negotiation. That's inevitable, and I accept that leads to uncertainty legally and for business. But I think the British government has set out very clearly the end game of the relationship that we want with the EU in the future. The white paper, the Bloomberg speech back in January, the Article 50 letter itself is very clear that we want I forget the exact word, deep and special economic partnership with the EU, absolutely. And also a very close security relationship with the EU. And this comes back to your point, Alistair, about solidarity. This is not something we're walking away from. But I think in economic terms, we're very clear that you're right, we can't be members of the single market if we're not members of the EU. We know that. We want a free trade agreement, an economic partnership with the EU that based on mutual recognition, which keeps the regulatory framework more or less the same in both blocks. We accept that means we have to be rule takers rather than rule makers. That's the price we're willing to pay. We want an agreement which has zero customs, zero tariffs, as close regulation as possible. We know we want to be outside the customs union precisely because we value free trade with the rest of the world as well, and we need to be able to have the freedom to do that. So there is actually a very detailed framework of the sort of relationship we want. So I just want to challenge the characterization that we're running around with our hair on fire and not knowing what we want.
Yes, thank you. And that was not a question, but I'll let you continue because I think we needed that perspective because the panel was maybe not that balanced when it comes to that. So I will, let's do this in order. Okay, so the first question was about British citizens in Sweden. What will happen with them? Maybe Maria?
I think that we all want to safeguard the rights for citizens to stay where they are today, whether we talk about European citizens in the UK or UK citizens in various European countries. The question is, what rights will they have? And that has to be sorted out. And what will be the cut-off date? Are we talking about citizens who moved to the UK before the referendum or maybe before last of April in 2019? There are things to sort out, but I think we are on both sides focusing on, or at least we agree that people should have the right to stay. And on internal borders, yes, I think the internal borders will be dismantled between Denmark and Sweden no later than November this year. So that's I think, good news. But on this last little intervention, if I just may say, I do think the situation is less clear now than it was before the elections, though, because the government didn't really get support for the hard line.
Yes,
okay,
but,
okay, never mind the elections.
A lot of people, I'm speaking to ministers in Sweden. Yes, we know that the speech that Theresa May gave in the beginning of the year still officially stands, but there's been kind of a different tone from the British government, which I suppose confuses people and makes some people think that the British government is maybe going for a softer version of that speech. Yes, say a bit more about that. I'll bring you up here. No, you can
So our position hasn't changed. Our position is exactly as it was set out in the white paper and in the Article 50 letter. Actually, if you look at the election results, the election manifesto that Labour ran on, if you really boil it down to it, is pretty much the same.
That's a good point. Yeah.
Labour stood on a position of wanting to end freedom of movement, retain a lot of the sort of access of British companies to the single market and European companies to vice versa to the British market. That's basically the same position as the government. Now there is more uncertainty around the transition phase because we haven't set out what we want in that implementation phase. That's a negotiation. So I accept that there's uncertainty about that, and you talked a bit about that. But actually, the fundamental idea of what relationship the UK wants with the EU hasn't changed, and I think actually there's fairly broad consensus around that.
Okay.
So this ties into Carl Tam's question about British domestic politics. Sort of, will this deal pass Parliament?
Yeah. Can I just say, Aidan, absolutely, it's not my intention to caricature. I suppose the problem is for most of the last 44 years, I've been at the coalface rather than at the political level. And in terms of concepts, I agree that nothing has changed since the white paper and the speech earlier this year. I absolutely agree with that. One of the problems, though, is that some of the terms used, you know, a deep and special relationship, which has the maximum amount of freedom of economic exchange between us and the European Union, that is well understood. There is, though, I think, a very important difference between going for a customs union model and a free trade model. That is where, I think, with respect, there is still a debate, or there appears to be a debate going on. So, and that is actually very important for business, because you know, if we have a customs union model, well, that point I mentioned in the first part of the mandate, you know, about disentangling it all, we can stay in those agreements. Well, that's a terrific thing for the third countries. Of course, there are politicians in London who will bang the table and say, well, absolutely not. We want to get out there and negotiate our own deals. By the way, just to say, sorry, it's a bit long, but just to say one other thing. There's a big illusion. The idea that we will somehow export more to China by being outside the EU than in it is, of course, a complete fallacy, because there's nothing, it's like Texas and Illinois, their exports are their exports. You export in accordance with your competitive position. Of course, being inside the EU, you have the protection of the external tariff and external trade wall, whereas if you're on your own, you may find the New Zealanders and the Australians and the Chinese and the Americans being a damn sight more demanding, because they want to get more access for their lamb and their cheese and what have you. So, I mean, I agree with you. I agree. It's wrong to caricaturize, but still, industry in the City of London and throughout the UK lacks the detail needed to plan. And of course, one of the problems is, as long as the EU insists on a sequential approach, it is not possible to look to the future till we clear up the past. So I absolutely agree. On the gentleman...
Sufficient progress.
So Erik wanted to come in. And don't forget the question about British domestic politics, if that creates extra risk.
Can I turn to Mr. Hamilton's point, which was about the European Parliament? And the European Parliament has proven, well, let's use the term difficult in the past, in the sense in relation to international agreements, getting them passed, for example, and the European Parliament will play a very, very important role in these negotiations. That's one thing. Another factor to consider, one other institution on the EU side to consider, is the European Court of Justice, and I'm talking about its role in the forthcoming negotiations. Of course, an institution or a member state may ask a question to the European Court of Justice, asking, is the agreement that we now negotiated, is it compatible with the EU treaties or is it not? And the European Court of Justice have answered those kind of questions in the past, and on some occasions they've said, no, actually, you can't sign this agreement. And they did so, for example, with the first version of the EEA agreement. They also did so again with the European Convention on Human Rights, which the European Union is not a party to. Those 2 points, I think, are important to remember. A third point, of course, is the member states, and remarkably, and I say this remarkably about the European Union, they have taken the stand that Article 5, the divorce proceedings, the divorce agreement, will be signed and concluded exclusively by the European Union. They have taken this approach that Article 50 gives the European Union a mandate, a one-off exclusive competence to sign that agreement on its own, which is quite remarkable in itself. And that is fine when all is well. If the member states start to disagree and actually realizing we may want something else in this divorce settlement, then that might become problematic. Moving on then to the trade agreement, which in all likelihood will be concluded at what we call a mixed agreement. And a mixed agreement, and that is an agreement concluded by the member states and by the European Union together. And that means that a regional parliament in Belgium, for example, might say, well, actually, hang on, we don't agree with this. We don't want to sign this agreement. Yes. And that's exactly what happened with the CETA agreement. So not only we say there are complications and implications on the UK side, but there are also issues to consider on the EU side. And I think that's important to keep in mind.
So I'm going to let Alistair come in on Carl Hamilton's question on the British Parliament. And I know you want to come in on CETA, but I think we're going to leave that and go to 2 more questions from the audience. If you want to comment on Mr. Hamilton's point about the British Parliament.
About the British Parliament, yes. Yeah. Oh, I mean, I have to, excuse me, completely agree that what's going to happen in British politics over the next 10 minutes, let alone the next 10 weeks or 10 months, I wouldn't like to guess. We're in a very, very volatile and unpredictable situation. And of course, if the Parliament, I mean, after the Gina Miller case, the Parliament has an acknowledged role now in this process, much as the UK might have liked to just negotiate it at executive level. And it is quite possible that there would be no agreement in the Parliament to ratify an agreement with the EU. But of course, if that happens, you know, there will then be no agreement between us and the EU as to the future relationship. It is quite possible.
Yeah, but
If you say so. I mean, the Prime Minister now has a 5-year term under the Fixed Parliament Act. We now have 5 years.
Got a
unless there's a vote
majority.
of confidence and so on. Yes, unless she loses a vote of confidence, in which case back to the electorate.
Yes.
Of course, it doesn't facilitate the UK's negotiating position at all for the Foreign Office or anybody else with the EU.
And the point from the British Embassy about the difference between Mr. Corbyn's Brexit policy and Theresa May's might not be enormous, right?
Yes, I mean, the options, the thing is, it's all very well to say we have to look at the detail and not talk in concepts, but we can either do customs union or we can do some form of preferential free trade agreement. And I think the other point to remember is that we live in a world of 160 member states in the WTO, and whatever we agree, I mean, there will be, the Americans will have something to say, and the Australians will have so this is not done in a vacuum, that's all. And so the sooner we crack on with it, the better. And I think what we're lacking, with respect, you know, is that the UK political situation has not enabled us to take a firm, clear position to progress on all these issues. It's hard at the moment.
So, unfortunately, we don't have time for more questions. We're going to move on to the last round for the panel. Just your sort of best advice to sort of Swedish businesses right now trying to navigate this, sort of one thing to keep in mind, Alexandra.
Advice to myself.
Advice to yourself. Advice to yourself.
Yeah.
Good. No, people who come to you and say, "Well, you're doing a good job with this. What what should we do?"
I do think that it's you have to prepare for the unexpected. I said it again, but to scrutinize yourself as much as you scrutinize the market and see what you can do and what differences. Because when it happens, it can go really fast. So we have to, and of course, we always, you know. And the UK is not the only country where there are these kind of protectionistic tendencies, let's say, that we are in. So I mean, and I think that's like the core of a sustainable company. You got to keep looking.
Political risk.
Yeah.
Lena.
Yes, 3 quick advices. You said 1, but I go for 3.
Okay, you go for 3.
So
fine.
it's just follow the development very, very closely. Made up scenarios so you know how you will be probably be affected, even though you don't know the outcome. And the third one is actually to look over your global footprint.
Global footprint. Thank you. Erik?
Yes, well, I don't agree entirely with your approach on what Swedish companies actually do. I'm quite sure they do an economic analysis of what's going on. In terms of, from a legal perspective, I think there's a bit of a difference there. And please, I mean, I say this to Swedish companies, do stay on top of things and be involved and do find out how you're affected by EU law, because it matters much more than you know.
And Maria Åsenius, you're much more optimistic.
No, I think it's wise to work on the assumption that Brexit really will happen. It's the most likely scenario.
Yes.
And then, of course, there are sub-scenarios which companies, unfortunately, will have to also prepare for.
Thank you.
I'm going to end with one very personal remark, which those of you who were at the Stockholm School of Economics will remember. In 1939, my father came to Stockholm on one of his rare exits from the United Kingdom. He didn't travel very much. Came to a big scout jamboree, Boy Scout jamboree in Stockholm. And this was in May 1939. And King Gustav addressed the 10,000 scouts from all over the world. And he said, even at this late stage, let us hope that World War can be avoided. Now, I'm not going to be like that famous Liverpool football manager, Bill Shankly, who said that, football is not life and death. It's much more important than that. And I'm not saying that Brexit is life and death. It's much more, but it is much more important than that. And I have 5 little people, grandchildren, for whom I very much hope that this somehow turns around. because I do not actually see a world in which the UK is floating off into the Northwest Atlantic, ever disintegrating, frankly, politically, whatever happens now with the Scots or the Welsh and the Northern Irish. I mean, I would be prepared to put a certain amount of money on the table which says, perhaps not in my lifetime, but in my children's lifetime, Scotland will be an independent state and Ireland will be reunited. But where does that leave? This is you know, please don't worry. Please don't put this in the reporting telegraph.
Oh,
but this is not bringing our country with such a glorious history, sometimes not so glorious, but anyway, glorious history. It is not bringing us forward, and I regret that. I regret the lack of vision, and I regret over 44 years the failure of politicians in Britain to tell the story accurately without fear or favour to the electors, because the referendum was a travesty, the antithesis of democracy, because it was conducted on a complete absence of telling the story about what a united Europe can bring and has brought, and that the myths and unrealities about Brussels and centralisation and a single state and losing control, so much rubbish. We're in a world where we have to share and we have to act in solidarity with others, whether we're in or out. End of story. Sorry.
Yeah. End of story. Well, it's not the end of story. I mean, this panel has ended, and I hope we've succeeded in at least making you confused on a higher level. But if we've learned anything from the last year in politics and economics, is that everything can change and anything can happen very quickly. So thank you, Vinge, for organising this, and thank you all for coming, and thank you to the excellent panel. Thank you.
Thank you.
Well done. Thanks to you too. Super. Well done.